Hello, everyone. How are we all today? Oh, good.
Wonderful.
Excellent. Excellent. So, here is our working group special, and we have some more people. So that's excellent to see. So, I was thinking for this one of turning it over to Eric to run through his adjustments on the PR side. I can't. I'll put my teeth back in. Thinking of passing it over to Eric to run through his PR in there, and then have a look at David's as well, and then open it up to the floor.
Sure, thanks, Lee. So I think actually there's 2 PRs now that I've submitted on the community repo, both relating to working group structure. So there's the one that Stefan and I had worked on last week that's focused on some earlier definition for a group that would be managing CF deployment and associated assets. And we had proposed that it subsume all the community deployments that we're providing for the CF app runtime. And then yesterday, David and I had worked on a broader grouping of a proposal for the rest of the working groups and how they would subsume the existing projects. So I think that's also something that is the primary topic that we want to have for this meeting. So we could maybe take a pass over the deployments working group charter proposal initially, but then I think it'd also be productive to cover the broader structure because obviously those that initial working group is going to be fitting into that broader set of working groups. And I think there's even some minor discrepancies of scope there once we were trying to figure out where things would land. So let me, I'll pull up links to those PRs. One sec.
Sounds good, Eric. And then I can briefly talk about the small changes I made to roles, and we can move on to the main agenda.
Okay, 139 is just for that reference deployments working group. And then the overall structure is 140.
And maybe before we get into working groups too much, since that is the main item, I'll paste the PR that I did around roles. And if you open it up, you can see that I added a role for the non-member, so like everyone. And we expanded the role of the approver, we expanded the responsibilities and the scope of the approver role to include some small maintenance tasks as well. We didn't think it was reasonable that all of the maintenance tasks fell onto the working group lead, essentially, responsibility-wise. Like, working group leads are responsible for a fairly large number of code bases, and say, like, you do all the maintenance in the tech debt is not scalable.
Well, how about I share my screen with the text of that first PR? Does that sound okay? So yeah, this is the rendered view for the markdown. And we were following some of the working group charter structure that we'd seen from Knative. And Stefan, I think I'd reorganize things a little bit after we had talked.
Yep, but yeah, basic idea is still the same, so no problem.
Yeah, so I think we originally had this kind of pithy one-liner statement around the mission, and I think I had extracted some of the intent for these different audiences for the working group into a slightly larger explication in terms of goals that we would have overall for the working group. So we're really viewing this as providing reference deployments of the CF app runtime that serve these three audiences. So primarily the CF community end users, and then secondarily the community contributors, and then thirdly the commercial vendors of CF app runtime distributions. And so for those end users, we want to give them some community reference way of installing and evaluating and then operating the CF app runtime in whatever form makes sense for an infrastructure target that we'd be supporting in the community. And then, I think one thing that we'll have to keep in mind for this working group is that there are going to be limits to how good that reference distribution can be. And so I think that's the other side of providing end user support, knowing how far we're practically going to be able to provide value to those end users. And then, we still want to have this mandate of supporting community contributors as they integrate their component changes into the reference deployments and continue to verify correct behavior for what we view as the correct functionality of the CF app runtime. And then thirdly, in terms of vendors and other service providers of the app runtime, providing at least some starting point for them for a commercial distribution and their offer. And so then Stefan and I had explicated a bunch of the more detailed responsibilities that we see the working group handling in practice around these areas. So this is where it's a little bit more specific, but also more output oriented in terms of, okay, well, what's the working group? What do we envision them actually doing in terms of their set of responsibilities? One thing we did want to call out was that we wanted to make it out of scope for this working group to be bundling a lot more around the CF app runtime. So like those reference distributions wouldn't be including managed services, for example. As part of it, it would just be focused on the CF app runtime. We didn't have a couple questions that we were debating and trying to even determine how much we should be even stating explicitly in terms of the scope and mandate for this working group. And primarily around the API and behavioral consistency. If we're going to have multiple of these reference deployments in the community, what kind of guarantees do we want to be saying about them in general in terms of behavior and API compatibility? And then honestly, how much should this working group own, especially if that responsibility might end up landing elsewhere in practice? Like, if they're bundling components together, but a lot of those decisions are being made in other working groups that are generating those components. So I think, as we work through this, these are things we'll want to try to resolve or to decide if we need to punt. Obviously, we're figuring out who the proposed leadership is. So, but we'll want to figure that out as part of actually launching the working group. And then we thought it was useful to explicate some of the actual specific repos that this working group would be responsible for. So I think elsewhere we've been using just the current project as shorthand for that. But when we actually start one of the working groups, I think we'll want to have that list of assets delineated specifically as part of shedding the previous project structure. So that was effectively our thinking around the scope of this working group.
Great. Well, part of why we did this was we didn't have the full picture of any proposed full set of working groups. So now it's getting kind of complicated because we have a lot of definition about a proposal for this one. And then we have some other proposed working groups that don't have as much definition. Do folks want to look at a couple of proposals for the complete sets and then see how this fits into it? Or do we want to go ahead and execute this one? And then, I imagine we want to look at the complete set to make sure this makes sense. And then maybe go ahead and execute one fully.
That sounds like a sensible approach to me.
Okay. Well, I can switch over to the other PR that gives that larger proposal for the full set of working groups. So I think as we'd been talking about, we're trying to find that right level of granularity and number of working groups for the amount of participation and leadership that we can expect in aggregate. And so David and I were tending to prefer larger working groups for that reason, just because then there's less fragmentation of any of that leadership structure. And we'll see, I think, generally each one of these working groups having at least some domain that's fairly active, even if others are more in maintenance mode or more stable. Maybe the easiest thing to do is even to look at that public Miro board that we had set up for Jan's proposal. So I added a frame to that with the set of projects that would be subsumed under these working groups. So as we were grouping things, we definitely saw a lot of existing projects that were associated primarily with the app runtime, and then of course some of the other additional domains around that, including Bosch and OSPAPI and Picado. So as we were grouping things, we did start to see some crystallization points around these different regions. So here's the runtime deployments group. And as we were thinking about that, we thought it also would make sense. If we're including kubectl in that, it's got a close relationship with Quarks. And so although we've had Quarks in the Bosch PMC, we thought that there was more cohesion there in terms of Quarks being used principally to support kubectl at this point. So that was part of the proposal. We also were looking at the Bosch bootloader project, which is, I think, still technically under the infrastructure project in the runtime PMC. And again, that seems like it's mostly there to support release integration, although I could see that one going on either way, either to this or a group containing Bosch.
Right, it just has like a lot of Terraform that's very Cloud Foundry specific in it. So it seems like it is not designed to be a generic Bosch bootloader, and instead designed to be a thing that installs Bosch so that you can install Cloud Foundry.
And then looking at the kind of center of gravity around Bosch, obviously that should kind of anchor a working group. And as we were looking at the other components that both Bosch integrates with or bundles together, or that are also used in the app runtime. I mean, we saw things like UAA and CrudHub being applicable to both domains. And as we were thinking about the overall structure of the app runtime, we have had a MySQL project and a Postgres release project, but again, they both seem kind of more foundational. Like the current PXE release is not a brokered release; it's just the deployment of the multi-master MySQL cluster. And so, as we were trying to get these somewhat chunkier groupings of projects, those seemed like kind of a more cohesive unit here, especially because there's not a lot of active development going on with those. These would be more dormant projects with, I think we expect most of the activity happening around Bosch and UAA. And then for the rest of the app runtime components, we were seeing also a pretty natural division point around CAPI, and then going outwards to encompass the clients that we have within the community that are either providing direct access generally to the CC API endpoints through things like the CLI or web UIs such as Stratos, or they're building on top of it to provide added value and experience for app developers. And so, we were kind of concerned that if we just separated off some of the things like autoscaler and multi-apps and notifications from that, that might not be enough to have a particularly active working group. So we thought for the time being, it would make sense to bundle those into this larger collection of app runtime centric interface activity. And then effectively we have the backend parts of the app runtime platform there. So that would generally cover all of the components that are actually connecting that API intent to infrastructure. So on the Bosch side, that would be Diego and Garden in terms of execution and Windows containers. And then we'd have the networking working group in there to represent app connectivity effectively, along with HA proxy as the operational edge of that. And then logging and metrics there is, again, the infrastructure that that's supporting that. One thing we were debating is like, should any of the API components in these areas actually go over into app runtime interfaces? Like on paper right now, this would pull the routing API into in with the rest of the networking things. And likewise, it would pull things like log cache or traffic controller in here. But those do have public API facing components. I guess also there's the network policy server that has public API components as well as internal ones. So that could be a second level of division that we might have to figure out in terms of which assets go where once we get past the high level working group structure.
Same is true for UAA, right?
Yeah, that's also true. Although, there I think, again, that that is integrated both with Bosch and with the app runtime. So maybe we get to elide that point by putting it down here.
Yeah, UAA is tough though, because it's used independently as well by
Exactly.
outside of the Cloud Foundry context, right? People still adopt it in other ways.
Yeah.
And that's true with all the stuff in the foundational infrastructure, right? These are kind of standalone components that can serve a purpose. That MySQL release can be used as the backend for Bosch. That Postgres release can be used as the backend for Bosch or of Cloud Foundry, or as the backend for anything. So those are all kind of standalone projects that are in support of the broader ecosystem.
That's a good point. Makes sense.
Yeah, and then
go on.
Oh no,
I'll
go ahead. Yeah.
Just put it to the end. Yeah, one thing I noted is like the MySQL and Postgres release in foundational infrastructure, aren't they more or less to have a batteries included CF deployment? So should we move them over to the, like similarly to having Quarks near to kubecf, to have the the bubble things over there, because it's supportive things for the community deployments. But that was just a thought.
No, you're totally right. Although it shouldn't be. That Postgres release should be the backend for Bosch. It's just that Bosch, for some reason, also bundles its own Postgres release, which doesn't make a lot of sense, and there's historical reasons for that. So, like in theory, those would also be viable batteries included backends for Bosch, and then they belong in foundational infrastructure, except that they aren't, and nobody ever does.
So then it is a question of intent, right? If we can convince the foundational infrastructure working group to consider using that MySQL release for Bosch, you're totally right. If we can't, anyway, that's just. And like one comment, because it came up with like what assets are where, and that like assets might be a problem in where we put things. I think there's no problem in being an approver in multiple working groups. So I think we should align working groups in terms of like, do they have something like a common roadmap, not in terms of where do they do code changes. If that makes any sense.
It totally makes sense.
Yeah. Anyway, as far as the rest of the working groups are concerned, we also want one that is centered primarily around OSPAPI and the service management and service broker activity. So there, it seemed like the Cloud Service Broker and Service Fabric projects, there's some natural affinity there in terms of those also being, I think, relatively general in terms of integrating with that OSPAPI experience. I think we're at this point, now that the MySQL working group is really just providing that core MySQL cluster and not a brokered service. I think honestly, the only real example of a brokered service we have that's active within the CFF is the volume services. So again, this is maybe up for debate. Like, should this go here? Should this just go to be part of the app runtime platform? Because some of that scope has been providing the extensions that integrate onto a Diego cell to actually be able to provide any kind of volume service. And then some of it has been specific brokering systems for NFS and SMB. So I think this one's potentially on the fence, but also the app runtime platform group is already pretty large.
Right, we got to put if you're going to build a services group, it has to be significant enough to live.
Mm-hmm.
You were talking about Jan, you were talking earlier about like intent and so on for these things and roadmap. I was thinking about the top 2 working groups. They actually should be combined. They're just too big, right? Like sometimes we might need to separate for scale purposes, but like in theory, the whole app runtime should have a common like roadmap and so on. It's just, I don't know how to have it be that big, right? Like it's always weird to separate out the API and the clients from the backend, because like you have features like HTTP2 that like just they're like, oh, also it's in the CLI, and also there's a little bit in CAPI, and also it's in GoRouter, right? So you end up with these features that cross-cut all the time. But I don't really see a solution to that. I think you sometimes have to shard for scalability or performance reasons.
Yeah, anyway, just to close this out, we do know that there's a group task with vulnerability management, and I think Paul is here, right? So great, Paul, you're still heading that. So we did want to represent that. And I think one thing we talked about in the past was also, I feel like we've always had docs in kind of a gray zone state in terms of governance. Like it's been something that we've developed in the community, and it's even been hosted publicly, but we've never really had a lot of explicit governance around it. And so having a working group that's dedicated to overall that community experience, including primarily docs, but potentially I think having scope outside of that, even things like maybe a more definitive set of sample or reference apps to run on the app runtime would be really valuable. So that seemed also, again, like some good activity in the community that would be valuable to bring out more formally. And then last but not least, there's the whole build pack area. And so there, we've got Pacato as something that's been pretty independent as a project, and maybe less obviously under CFF governance, unless you get all the way down to the footer on its website. And then also the existing CF-centric build packs. So just for owning that whole build pack scope, we thought that would make sense under a single working group. But I don't see Emily on the line. She'd also been bringing up the idea of just keeping Pacato completely separate and moving build packs, either like the existing CF build packs, into a separate working group, or potentially consolidating it with the platform work. So I think, again, there's, we're seeing that optionality of placement for the existing build packs project as well as one option. Anyway, so that's roughly how we were trying to divide things up more broadly. But again, this is where I think we need to figure out maybe even the next level of definition. My proposal had included some initial mission statements for each one of these areas to give that overall sense of scope for the working group. But I think, practically speaking, to make any of these working groups functional, we'd probably want to start identifying a set of leads and approvers to actually staff them, because we can come up with all the working groups that we want, but if people aren't going to be participating in them, they're not going to work. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing. I'm curious to hear if there's any other initial reactions from folks on the TOC or the project leads and other folks that have joined us.
So in general, I like the idea of bigger working groups to foster the cooperation between the teams. because you talked explicitly about build packs, actually, I like the idea to have a build pack working group that owns old and new, because talking about roadmaps, one of the most critical things is to find a migration path for the applications that are out there simply. And if we would put Paketo completely outside the structure, I have a feeling what will happen. Nothing, and that's not good. The same is true for things like API. I mean, you cannot have the V2 API in the working group 1 and the V3 API. That would be nonsense, right? It doesn't make sense. The same is, there's one thing that stands here like an elephant, that CF4K is sort of missing. What's up? I guess that has an idea or an agenda or whatever.
Oh, well, I mean, that's currently under release integration as a project. I think at one point we had broken those out about how they might move around, but
okay.
it is within that scope. Yeah.
Maybe we should put it here because that's explicitly to just make it clear.
Yeah,
maybe
we had
write
it on
CF
ours.
deployment and CF4K. Okay, that was looking for me as if it has been taken out by intention, but then I misinterpreted it.
Yeah, we might have forgotten it when we created the mirror board.
Like,
all good.
Oh yeah, I think on some previous discussions we had them broken out, but since they all were landing there, I just consolidated those to save stickies. Although that might cost VMware its lead in the Miro sticky note creation rankings for this year.
Comments from the community of people that might actually be part of such a working group.
My biggest takeaway, I'm from the networking area, is just, wow, that's a big working group. That's a lot of things. But I also understand why they're grouped that way. And was it Leah or was it Stefan who said they liked big working groups? That's a nice way to look at it. I'll keep that in mind.
I guess, yeah, with Stefan's point, it does make making changes a lot more easy to orchestrate.
Yeah, I think I've just been so used to working in, just my area. It'll just be a change, but that doesn't mean it's bad.
Yeah, I mean, that is something we want to be sensitive to, is the overall scope that these larger working groups would place on leads. So as someone that I think we have very much in mind to have a leadership role in that working group, do you think that would be manageable for you? Would it depend on the other folks that would be your co-leads?
Yeah, I feel like I remember hearing that maybe they were going to be co-leads and maybe I heard there wasn't. Has that changed since? I don't know. Maybe you can elaborate on that more.
Totally. I mean, there are 2 official leadership roles in the roles list. Those 2 roles can be fulfilled by 1 individual. They can be fulfilled by 2 individuals. I don't know if they are allowed to be fulfilled by 3 or more individuals, but we could certainly talk about it.
absolutely they are.
Yeah, I was about to say there's no reason why we shouldn't have multiple tech leads or execution leads.
The execution lead is sort of the product roadmap centric lead. And then the tech lead is the technical, obviously. I think for people who are really interested in only one area of it, lead may not be the right role. It might just be you are the chief approver of logging or networking or Diego.
So one of the ways that we do things on GovUK PAS is we often have component leads. So it's splitting that tier so your tech lead doesn't have to hold the context of all the things. They've got people that they can go to that have got that context and that detail level. Might that prove useful working in these larger groups?
I kind of went through a thought exercise yesterday of whether I should try to PR in a role like that. And I think we're trying to be lighter weight with the amount of like open source governance and overhead involved in continuing the project. So I'd rather not personally make that an official role. I think there will be in de facto experts in all of these components and areas, right? Absolutely. But I don't think that requires an official leadership role. I think it's nice. Basically, the official leadership roles are the working group, the two leadership roles that we've defined. And those are going to be difficult jobs, right? They're going to be like, develop a plan for this whole backend or this whole like Cloud Foundry API and front end or all the services space. Like they're going to be somewhat time intensive, difficult roles, but I think that's on purpose, right? I personally would rather have fewer of those roles that are more involved where people can focus on them. And it's not a very, very loose part-time job that occasionally comes up. It's like, there's actually enough stuff each week to keep you engaged. It's not probably a full-time job, hopefully, but it's like really pretty heavily part-time engaged.
It's like, I can imagine that for larger components or larger areas, those that could have a role of a component lead will actually be co-leading the whole working group.
Well, we could put it in the list of roles or not, right? That's the question.
I was just suggesting that we shouldn't. Like, a working group can organize however they want. And if it's about recognition, then just make this people that you would assign a component lead role, just make them co-leads of your working group, right?
Yeah, so like I see we've got Ben here as well, given that we're including logging and metrics in this area. You know, Ben, you to me seem like a natural candidate to be another one of those technical leads in the platform group. And I think having that specialization and focus on some of the domain areas or those groups of components totally makes sense to me. And again, that's where I think we've said all along that we want to give working groups the latitude to have substructure and to organize their own affairs, so long as they're continuing to adhere to whatever common technical and process expectations we set across the working groups. But beyond that, it's up to individual working groups.
So we could look at alternate options too. It seems like there was an existing proposal as well that was PR'd in for the working group structure from a very early conversation. I don't even remember who the authors of that proposal are because I'm that disorganized. Do the people who worked on that want to make a case for reviewing that, or is this does the new proposal supersede that existing proposal? And are we happy moving forward? Like, I'm just trying to figure out, like, do we want to look at some other options?
I think I was the one opening the PR, and it was really just meant as a strawman proposal to just get some kind of list in there, right? I just went over the Cloud Foundry community site projects that existed and just tried to put things under a common title. So no, there's no need to actively look into that from my side. I think lots of these things are allocated close to that. I mean, I think we started the Miro board actually by also at least taking some of the ideas from the Strawman proposal too.
Yeah, that sounds right to me. I think we this spring, as we've been doing another pass at that, we started there. We did a review of all the existing projects and our assessment of how active they actually were. That's something we may need as further input. I know the extensions PMC has been pretty dormant for a while, but doing a pass over that to see what's actually active and what would be more appropriate to retire would be helpful. And Chip, I know Chris had done that a few months ago, I think as part of having temporary oversight of that PMC. But I don't know if we ever came up with a definitive list. I didn't see anything in the PMC notes since February.
Yeah, I mean, I think in reality, we're going to just have to go through a bit of a reset, and it's always healthy, right? Because we have people wander off, and if we've got code assets at the end of all this juggling that don't have owners and aren't being maintained, Time to go read only in the attic.
I feel like if we don't get more feedback from folks, at some point we're going to finalize these recommendations for W working groups. So this is your chance to say you don't like something, or move on, right?
I think the words are "speak now or forever hold your peace."
For what it's worth, I'll give you my gut reaction based on my kind of historical knowledge. I think the two interesting ones are the interface and kind of runtime group, and how you. The others all seem fairly good. I was just playing in my mind, like, what are the options for those? And I think one option is, you know, to like vertically slice all those things, but I guess that's a little bit too much like the original setup, so kind of ignored that one. Although I would eventually love to see the architecture kind of move to a point where it was all componentized, and, you know, a networking team could kind of contribute their pieces into a generic CAPI server and so on, but that's for ways down the road. So the other alternative I can think of is the one you got. The only other one I can think of really is like a clients and extensions or additions. Move CAPI over to the runtime and just have that as the runtime, and then leave everything else where it is, and kind of call it like clients and extensions or something like that. And then at least the advantage I see of that one is then at least, you know, you kind of have all of the pieces of Cloud Foundry kind of central under one working group. But maybe that's too, you know, then you're to what you're saying. Then you know, it's a question of having working groups that are too large. But that was my thought process as you were talking through it, right?
And maybe then the clients group is too small,
Yeah.
right? Like there aren't a lot of open source clients that are really active except the CLI. So you're basically saying there's a CLI working group, and anytime you change CAPI, you also need to change CLI.
Yeah.
From
Gatos,
the history,
I guess,
we know the cohesion between CLI and CAPI, right? And you can wish whatever you want from CAPI or try to extend something. It simply won't work because
so you put CAPI over there, and then that's a cohesive unit. Yeah, I see. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, there's like a set of features and changes that are all about the like tenancy and organization structure, like spaces and orgs and permissions and so on. That could all be done in that CAPI CLI range. And then there's unfortunately a set of features that augment both the back end and the front end. And you know, unless you build one working group that is huge, you're going to end up with collaboration, right?
Yeah.
This problem exists everywhere, right? If we talk, for instance, about CredHub, is it optional? Is it required? Should it be shipped everywhere? It requires discussion in all the teams, in the CAPI, in release integration and things like that. If you try to, let's say, just imaginary, you try to retire CredHub, everybody has to do something, and same is true.
And again, I would put emphasis on there's nothing that is saying that like Diego, Irene, networking contributors are not allowed to also be CAPI contributors, right? Yeah. And like committers, like approvers over there. By like, it may be a really good idea to then actually require them to attend both working group meetings as approvers in both, which might already lead to the coordination we need falling in place automatically. Another thing I recently thought about is that like we might even have like kind of like temporary working groups for special topics where we have or need closer collaboration. Like one of my thoughts in terms of joining Paketo and the classical build packs would be, I know that the build packs working group has been working on a shim approach to make that possible. One idea I had was like one just natively run a cloud native build pack lifecycle in a Diego container like we do for classic build packs. And this would probably be a joint effort of like CAPI, maybe Diego, although probably this is fine enough and will run out of the box, and the build packs team. And that might even be a temporary working group, special interest group, whatever. And depending on how long we need that, maybe a working group with a structure like a lead and something, and they will need contributors. on all these fronts.
We don't have to forever hold our peace here, right? Like we can revisit this, right?
Of course.
That's also true. Very good point, Ben.
Yes. Forever being
Forever is like 6 months or something. We just want a draft proposal to start here to like start filling the roles or figure out what to do next. We actually I don't even know what we do after next. When we say these are the working groups, presumably we'll solicit interest in roles, leadership roles, and then do some sort of, anyway, I'm getting ahead.
I think
I guess sorry, Eric, go on.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, like, if we feel like this is a good starting point, maybe we can keep amending this PR to start filling in some of those candidate lead positions, just to get a sense of the amount of contribution and activity that we would have within each one of the working groups. So I think we can, we can start penciling in, especially people that are existing project leads, into these areas to try to get a more definitive sense of those as like initial set of contributors.
What about putting even potential approver candidates in, like people that we now know that are currently committers on the assets that are part of that, are natural, like should probably be there to show that.
Yeah,
like at least if they plan to be on the same project for some time.
right.
Yeah,
I think that's what Eric meant by contributors. Like we just use approvers and contributors to be in the same thing, because I can't remember the name of the role.
I think it is approvers.
It is approvers, not contributors, but I keep saying contributors. I'm so sorry.
Oh, okay. I thought that he had put emphasis on what would be potential lead candidates, which is also something that we can do, but that's anyhow probably something that maybe even the working group contributors have to figure out, to come up with a proposal of who should be leading the working group. What I was about to say with regards to how flexible are we with this, the good point from a point of view of a TOC member is, if we have this structure, it's up to you to say, yeah, that doesn't work for this particular reasons, and this is our proposal to change it. And that's a good thing. And we can just talk about it and do it. We don't have to come up with it. Anything from splitting a working group or combining them or merging them differently, whatever.
Okay, well, that sounds good as a next step. We'll keep this PR open. And obviously people should feel free to comment on it or make suggestions. And over the next week or so, we can try and fill in some of those actual people for those lead and approver roles. Should we switch over, speaking of the roles, to take a look at David's PR around refining some of those less committed areas of contribution?
What an excellent segue.
I mean, we could, but like, also the most important stuff is the working groups and how we are going to decide who does the leadership roles in those working groups collectively. And I don't think I understand the process by which we're going to figure that out yet. And I think if we like these set of working groups, the next step is either to like officially adopt them as the first wave of working groups, or to solicit community review for some period of time outside of this meeting. Ideally, we'd also have a process in mind by which people could be nominated or express interest in taking on one of those two leadership roles. And then we're going to need a process by which we make decisions about how those roles are filled. And I just don't know if I understand all that stuff. So like we could talk about minor changes to the roles that I proposed, but that's not very important. All they're doing is expanding the contributor role a little bit. And by contributor, I mean approver. So do other people on the TOC know how we're going to actually figure out those lead roles?
Yeah, and you're on mute.
First of all, I think by putting people in there as potential candidates for lead or approver positions by using their GitHub handles, will provoke reactions. Like they will definitely be aware of that proposal of how these working groups should look like and that they are apparently supposed to lead them or whatever, right? So I guess we should definitely keep this open to get feedback from the community, and we should probably even state for how long we plan to keep it open to get offline feedback. And I would say, what about 2 weeks from now? Then like we actually have a chance to, in 1 week, figure out that there's a lot of feedback and we should have another synchronous call on that, or figure or see that everything seems to be moving smoothly. And so that would be my proposal.
From perspective of the artifacts that we would want to have in place to start a working group running, I think the TOC would need to agree on the proposed name and charter for the working group, and then a set of leads. And so I think at that point, I see the connection point being to the leads, and then those leads would have the authority within the working group to, I think, decide approvers based on the baseline set of criteria. That said, I think that's something that we would want to have a rough idea of. We wouldn't need it to be totally formalized to start the working group, but having a rough sense of like, hey, yeah, so there's going to be some other people contributing in these areas. So I think that's probably where we need to then identify the leads and work with the proposed leads to ensure that this would be a viable working group and that it has the right scope and responsibilities as far as they're concerned.
Just to flag up on timelines, 2 weeks takes us to just beyond Summit.
Right. If we did 1 week, we could have it finalized before Summit. If we did 2 weeks, we could show the proposal and solicit additional review and say we're going to finalize it a week after Summit. Both are good.
I kind of lean towards the latter option, given that TOC is a new thing and we're still feeling our way in at the moment.
Sure, sounds good to me. I think, Eric, you and Jan are not fully aligned about like how the leads are going to get selected, because Jan, I hear you saying a proposal where essentially we take all the people who basically fill the approver role and we say, here's a draft working group. You are all approvers. Make a proposal for who does the leading of it. And Eric, I see more top-down tapping of like leads or nominating of leads on the TOC side from you, but that could just be me misinterpreting your. Is that fair?
I'm trying to remember what we had worked out even in some of the governance meetings around like how that definition would work. I'm browsing through the other documents that we have in here to see if we had anything more definitive about that. I mean, I think overall, we need there to be consensus between the TOC and whoever's participating in the working group about who the leadership would be.
Right, but I mean, we could do a like, we don't want to do the heavyweight process that we did for the TOC election, but something fairly similar. We could combine kind of these proposed lead selection process and say, we definitely want to create a draft working group and tag the approvers in it, so they all get extra notification that they're going to just de facto end up in this role, which is fine. They can shed it if they don't plan to continue it, but like they'll have good feedback about whether the working group is actually viable, right? We want to collect that feedback, and they'll probably have good ideas about which one of them might be interested in that leadership role. So there's got to be some nomination process. That being said, we also might want to TOC nominate a few people independently for whatever reason. So I think any nomination process, an open nomination process for those working group leads is reasonable. I think those what I'm trying to say is the lead nominations could come from a variety of sources, such as like vendors talking about their strategy for where they want to invest, such as, approvers saying, oh, I think I'd be good at this, or I think, Frank would be good at this, or so on. so I think we should open that up. We just need some sort of like deadline for when those nominations are due by, and some sort of reasonable, fair process to decide how we're gonna choose when there are multiple people interested. And if we don't think it makes sense to have too many in one area, then we're just gonna have to figure out a process that's fair.
Would a PR per working group work?
Yeah,
Because then
that's
at least
great.
you
So
can scope the,
right.
the discussion there.
Exactly. And so we make a PR, we tag the proposed approvers so they get notifications. We have a section that says, you know, technical leads, execution leads, you know, to be decided, or maybe even it's a to be decided and a sentence about how you nominate on the PR or something.
So I'm looking at roles.md, which in actually the table where it's talking about the requirements for both of the lead roles. So this is, again, I think language that we took from the Knative governance, but it does say that those lead roles need to be sponsored by the TOC. So I think the TOC is at least the formal decision point for those lead roles. But you know, again, I do think we want that to come from the larger pool of people that we would see being the approvers and the main committers in each working group. So maybe yeah. Oh, go ahead, Jan.
And I also think it doesn't make sense to nominate people kind of against the will of the majority of the approvers. So I would just put them in because it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
So formally, you're right. I think it's the TOC that sponsors working groups and their leads and whatever, and things should work out there. And there might be even like there might be some requirements we just put on people. Like I think one of the things that Dr. Jules once said about an important aspect of that is that the TOC actually like gets input from the working group leads about like how is contributions going, right? And like to foster participation of a community. And we might just have an idea of picking one over another if they are like equally qualified, equally agreed upon, things like that. So I think it's somehow a common process of finding the right people to do that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the overall goal is to have consensus between the TOC and the broader set of working group leadership down to the approver level. Yep. Okay, so it makes sense to me that we should be identifying that larger set of folks that we think would fill that approver role, and then working with them to identify the right level of leadership to place responsibility in. So I think we can be running that asynchronously over the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Means if we agree to this proposal to have one PR per working group, we basically preset the working group structure, right? Which I find okay, because if you have all the ends open, then nothing gets decided in the end. So you need a few points should be fixed, and then you go from there. And if it doesn't work out, you change it. But setting this up, and then maybe the next step would be to add the projects to the working group proposals just by taking the existing ones, and then go from there. I don't know if you want to take the committers of the existing, I mean, the technical GitHub committers and simply list them there, then it's just mechanical work. And you have a proposal where to start from, and then the discussion starts. That could work out, I would say.
One of the problems technically with this, like I was just about to say, then let's move the content of the current PR over to an issue that is going to be the overall thing where people can also comment on, I think we should have another working group, or if we should split this one. Like there would at least be a place to put this. But having or running multiple PRs will have merge conflicts, I think. only single working groups MD file.
Well, I think we'd probably, I mean, we'd likely want to concentrate most of the detail for the working groups in a charter document. And so those could be separate files.
Okay.
So that, I think that would help us avoid the mechanics of merge conflicts.
I have to drop off soon, but it sounds like we're going to start PRs for each working group, and we're taking the current structure as a starting place. Still room for comment, but we're starting there. Is someone going to be in charge of opening up all those PRs? Can we just ask the TOC to open up blanket ones? Like,
Yeah, I think we have to take responsibility for that. I'm on vacation for the rest of the week, so I'm going to excuse myself from this particular really exciting, not just boring mechanical labor responsibility.
I can make incremental progress on separate PRs for each proposed working group, and we can then tag the appropriate people for asynchronous discussion on those.
thank you, Eric, for that exciting, important work.
And Eric, if you tag the existing project leads, they can tag the other people, right? Like the goal is to get all the people that are basically doing the approver role tagged, and you don't want to do all that yourself.
Yep. Yeah, we know where they live. We'll ping them.
Sounds great.
Great. Well, we're about
Cool.
out of time. Does anybody have any concerns with my small change to the roles of expanding the approver role slightly for maintenance? Jan, I wanted you to re-review that PR after I made some changes, and feel free to suggest more changes on it. Otherwise, maybe we can have it asynchronously approved before next time.
I think it was fine. Just one thing, like I think the comment from Stefan was great to actually have an everybody section below where all the members are described. I think the rest was fine, but I can do that offline and give it a looks good to me. I think for the comments I concretely had, you addressed them
Okay.
mostly, and yeah, as I said, Stefan's comment to actually put that very explicitly as there's actually everyone is welcome was a good one as well, but that doesn't even have to be necessarily in the same PR. So. It was the everyone for the role and the only PRs for the signed CLA. That was basically it, right?
Okay, sounds like we're out of time. Hopefully, feel free to merge that. Since I'm out of town, if anybody wants to merge it and they feel good about it, merge it. Otherwise, I'll merge it when I return.
Cool.
Eric is actually a pending reviewer. I just approved. So
okay, I'll find some time in the next day or so to take a pass over that as well.
Oh,
great.
All right.
See you next time.
Thank you very much,
Next
all.
time.
Bye.
See you next
Bye-bye.